Hello, I'm Joshua, and I'm here to dispel a myth about Scribe Online connectors. They're not hard to build, they're very easy, they can be very fast, and you can get them deployed and get to working on your solution very quickly. And that's what Connector Outlaws is all about. It's about building your connector, getting it out there, and doing it quickly and fast. Hello, I'm Joshua Solomon. I work for Scribe Software.
I'm Symantha Gates. I'm here with Josh today to talk to you about the Scribe Online connector components.
All right, last time we talked about assessing your API or an API to work with Scribe Online and all the key components of an API that are useful when creating connectors. So today we're actually going to talk about connectors. We talked last time about what connectors do and the options for creating connections. Connectors expose data, expose your API to Scribe Online. They're easy to create, and there's two options.
Right, we've got the Fast Connector Framework, and we have the Connector Development Kit.
Yeah, and both options are free, available to anyone who wishes to create a connection, and can be used with trial accounts, and both options can also be certified.
Right, and I think that's actually all the information for this is just right on our public website. So it's under our help area, and the details for the Connector Framework are there, as well as for the Connector Development Kit.
Okay, today we're going to talk about the components that go into creating a connector, and these components are the same whether you choose to use the Connector Development Kit or the FAST framework. You have to build these four main components into a connector to work with Scribe Online. And so conceptually, we're going to work with the Connector Development Kit, and we'll talk about how to use these components and work with the FAST framework in a future episode. So today, the four main components are
connection, metadata, queries, and operations.
That's right. So connectors need to tell the Scribe Online agent how to connect to your API. The connectors also have to relay the metadata, the fields, the tables, and the relationships about your API to Scribe Online for exposure. And then the connector obviously accepts queries from the Scribe Online agent and operations and executes those queries and operations to get data to and from your API.
Right, so from a planning perspective, there's just those four things, and I think it's important to know that it's less than five, so less than the fingers on your hand.
That's right.
There's only four things that you have to worry about when you build a connector.
That's right. Working with the Connector Development Kit, you'll have documentation that we send you, and in that documentation we have this wonderful screenshot, which in a single screenshot explains to you all of the interfaces that are needed to create a connector, and that's what makes this a lot of fun. Is it's a single screenshot. There's very few interfaces to work with. So right now we're going to talk about the connection interfaces and what you do with those. Pre-connect. Pre-connect is where you describe in your C# code the form, the fields that you want to display to the user in Scribe Online to collect the credentials for authenticating against your API. So there's the pre-connect method, simply describing a form. And then after that, the Scribe Online agent will display on the screen those fields, username, password, URL, etc., for the user to enter that information. Once that user enters that information is sent to the connect method, where your connector will take that information, that username and password, and make the connection to Scribe Online to your API, and return to Scribe Online some information about whether or not you are connected, the is connected flag, and there you are, you're connected to your API. So once you've got that, you've actually technically got a full-on connector. It just doesn't do anything. It makes a connection to your API.
But that doesn't sound like a lot of code. Would you say that's a lot of code?
It is not. It's actually enough code to fill a single screen. Really, you literally just define a field and give it back to Scribe Online.
Okay.
The next item that we're going to talk about is metadata. The next thing that a Scribe Online agent asks for after the connection information is metadata. And the Scribe Online agent will call the get metadata provider method in your C# code. Again, we've got bare bones samples that will have all of this laid out, so all you really have to do is fill in the blanks. And here you're going to be filling in the blanks with a metadata provider, and you're going to be sending back objects to Scribe Online in the form of what we call entities or object definitions. And the object definitions will define your objects that you want to expose in the API. It will also expose the fields within those objects and any relationships associated with them. And again, this code is very simple, and you can see it here on my screen. Entities define the objects, the relationship to other objects, the properties, and the supported actions. So this screen here is the object definition, name, full name, description, whether or not it has relationships, whether or not it has properties, and the supported actions. Supported actions are going to be query, update, delete, those types of things. Within the property definition is another subset. The property definition has field names, field types, all of that information that you're familiar with. So again, the metadata is another simple item to create. So I can create a single property definition with this list definition that I have on the screen. And so again, your API, if it has discoverable metadata, which we talked about in the last episode, you could use that to auto-populate this type of information and simply loop through it.
Yep, and I think this is a great point too in terms of the prior video and how the maturity of the API, if there's enough ability to discover things with the metadata itself, that does make your job that much easier as you go through the connector development.
Absolutely. So you can imagine that there's two different ways to do a connector, to develop a connector, and that is I could hard code every single field with this information, or I could discover it dynamically through an API that has discoverable metadata. And so you can see how that fits in. So once we have our metadata, and once the agent has retrieved that information from you, now the agent is actually ready to build a map. That's enough information for a user of Scribe Online and a user of your connector to go in and build a map. They can see all of the entities in the entity dropdown. They can see all of the fields. They can map fields. They can create formulas to those fields. Your connector doesn't have to know about any of that information. All of that mapping is done by the agent and Scribe Online. And when the agent and the Scribe Online gets executed, or when your map gets executed, a data set or a query will be created by the Scribe Online agent, and that query will then be sent to your connector. So your connector receives a query ready to go, and the instructions are there. So your connector now only needs to actually execute that query.
Yeah, and yesterday we had a great example of that where we were showing somebody the Scribe Online user interface for the first time and showing them the fields available in their connector, and they were like, oh wow, I could tell they were like they kind of jumped out of their seat. They weren't expecting to see it that fast. So. Right,
exactly. So again, connectors are simple. They just simply need to answer these simple questions from the Scribe Online agent, and the agent will build that query for you and send it to your connector to the execute query function. The execute query function is, like I've just been saying, based on the metadata and the supported action and the properties that you've already defined in your connector. The execute query function, although it's not necessary for you to implement it in your connector if you're doing a write-only API. So if you're only doing is sending data, you don't need to do the execute query, but the execute query is required for your connector to support things such as filtering, last run date, or update operations. And that's pretty much it. We talked about execute query, and the next section, the last of the 4 components that are required for a Scribe Online connector is the execute operation component. And the execute operation actually encompasses the remainder of your CRUD operations, your create, your update, your upserts, and your deletes. So the execute operation method actually takes a data set built up by the agent and sends it to you and says, here's a set of data, go ahead and create a new record, or go ahead and update a new record. So the execute operation basically manages what type of operation your connection is going to do with a particular data set given to it by Scribe Online. Again, Scribe Online, or your connector, does not have to know anything that Scribe Online is doing. All of your mappings, your logic, your filtering, and your formulas, your connector doesn't need to know any of these things. So the connector development kit really is just a framework for you to plug in API calls that Scribe Online can access.
Right, and I think that's another important point, because a lot of people think that when they build a connector, they're going to have to build a configuration from the source to the target, and actually all they're doing is exposing their API to the broader Scribe ecosystem, and then it can be used across any of the other connectivity offerings that we have.
That's right, exactly. So I believe we've got a set of resources here. The CDK Online Help, this is going to be the documentation where you will find that screenshot that explains exactly what a connector does. We have video training, similar to what you're seeing here, and a number of individual tutorials for smaller subsections of the product. So those are your resources, and believe it or not, we're going to talk about the FAST framework in another episode, and it's going to be even simpler than building a connector.
Sounds good.
All right, we'll see you next time.